One of Adobe Illustrator's most coveted features is its ability to scale. We can take our original artwork and scale it up to the size of a building and then back again really small to maybe fit on the edge of a pen or a pencil and back again to our original artwork size. And we don't lose any detail in our artwork. So there's three different ways that I use the scale tool in Adobe Illustrator, and to illustrate those different ways, I've created this little kind of kite design with a few different stroke effects and some stroke details. So we have some varying stroke thicknesses. Here we have a thinner stroke, we have a dash stroke, we have a thicker stroke, and then here we actually have an offset path dashed stroke. So my original artwork lives down here, which you can see it's a live effect. So it's affecting everything that is happening along this path. And I've just done an offset on it. So there's a couple of different things happening with my artwork example here. So with our artwork selected, let's go ahead and go over to the tool palette here and double click onto the scale tool. And when we do that, a little pop-up menu comes up, and there's going to be two sections that we're going to focus on. One's going to be the scale section here, and the other one's going to be the options section here. So with the preview enabled, let's go ahead and go up to the scale section at the top here. And we have two options to do a uniform scale, which I'm going to activate now. And I'm going to change this to about 150% for this example. And I'm going to go ahead and toggle the preview on, off, and then on again, so we can see kind of what's happening here. So if we have two options, the uniform scale and the non-uniform scale. Just pretty much every time I use Illustrator, I'm going to be selecting the uniform scale. That's because I want my artwork to scale proportionately. Now there may be instances where you specifically want your scale to happen only in a horizontal axis or a vertical axis, and this non-uniform option is here available to you. So this part is pretty powerful actually, because you can mathematically calculate how much larger you want your artwork to be. Let's say your client comes in and says, hey, I like this artwork, but I'd like to see it 20% smaller. So you can go ahead and go in and by default, it should be 100%, and you can type in 80%, and then instantly your artwork is 20% smaller. So that's a really powerful tool you can use inside the scale pop-up menu. So the next options, these are going to be a global option. So no matter what different way you use to scale in Adobe Illustrator, these options are global. It's kind of like the hub for your control center for everything that has to do with scale. Happens kind of in this area. So if we uncheck the scale corners options, a few things are going to happen on our screen. So I'm going to go ahead and toggle this so you can see where this effect is happening. And you can see here I have a rounded rectangle, and it has a radius on the corners here. And if I uncheck that, it's going to default back to my 100% scale size. So that's something to keep an eye on. If you have a lot of artwork with a lot of corners on it that are rounded, this is going to affect that option here. So for most cases, you want to keep that checked so it scales proportionately. There may be some times where you want to uncheck that. And the same thing happens with our scale, stroke, and effects. So you can see here that when I toggle this on my artwork, if I uncheck it, then the 100% scale size of my stroke and my effect will happen. But if I check this, then it's going to scale proportionately with this number that we select up here, okay? So there's three different options at the bottom. We can either copy it, which will duplicate our artwork. We can cancel this option altogether, or we can hit OK. And there's one thing to remember once you hit OK to confirm all of your options here. Once you hit OK, your artwork will now be reset to its new size, and it will by default be the new 100% size. So just remember that when you click OK to confirm that. And let's go ahead and cancel this option. And there's one more thing that I actually want to show you with this option is when we hit S on our keyboard, which is the default keyboard shortcut for scale, you can see that we get a pivot point that pops up right here in mathematical center of our artwork. And if we click anywhere else on our key or on our canvas here, we can actually change where that pivot point is, okay? And let's say that we want our pivot point to be somewhere around here. And then we want to go into this first option and hit the scale tool. So if we double click to pop that open, you can see, well, it's switched over to non-uniform, so make sure you keep an eye on that, and then go back to uniform, and we'll click on 100% again. And you can see that by default, Illustrator took my pivot point that I had placed here and it put it right back to a mathematical center. So using this version or this method of the scale tool, you're always going to be scaling from mathematical center of your artwork. You don't have any other option but to do that. So that's something to keep in mind when you're using this method to scale. Okay, so let's talk about another way that we can use scale, and that's if we highlight our artwork. And if we go ahead and go up to the View tab, we click down, and about halfway down, we can see something that says Show Bounding Box. And if we click on that, then a new bounding box is going to appear, and we have some control tabs on the horizontal and vertical surfaces, and also on the corners. Okay, and if we actually grab one of these little handles and we can move them up in a vertical direction or on the y-axis, then we're going to only scale on that axis, okay? And the same thing applies to the horizontal axis or the y-axis. We're only going to scale on that direction. And just keep in mind, whatever handle you're grabbing it from, this side, it's actually going to be scaling it from this opposite direction using this method. So the same thing applies to the corner option, where you can apply, where you can affect both the vertical and the horizontal axes at the same time. And you could get some really strange effects because you can pull both axes at the same time. But if you want to constrain those proportions, you can just press and hold Shift at the same time, and you can do that here. So that's a pretty fun way to use the scale tool with the bounding box. And also, if you wanted to do the hotkey for the bounding box, it shows it right here where you say hide bounding box. It's a toggle, Shift Command B, and you can toggle that bounding box on and off as much as you like. So, and one last note with this last method with the bounding box. If I were to hit S by default on my keyboard, and I get the pivot point, you'll see that my bounding box disappears. So for some reason, Adobe Illustrator doesn't like it when you have the bounding box and the scale tool active at the same time. And that's because we're selecting a pivot point where we want that scale to happen from, okay? And if we hit the hotkey again, then, or if we click off of it, then our bounding box reappears and our pivot point disappears. So just keep in mind that that happens using this method. Okay, so for the last method, I'm gonna go ahead and activate a new layer, and it's these arrows that are pointing outward from my pivot point at a 45-degree increments. Okay, and I'm gonna go ahead and toggle off the bounding box so I no longer have that option. And we're gonna hit S on our keyboard, and our center point or our pivot point pops up in mathematical center. And you can see that I have aligned these arrows. Actually, let's see if I did. I'm gonna pull up my tabs. I may have shifted my center point over a little bit while doing this example. And yeah, it looks like I did. So I'm gonna go ahead and maybe bump this up and move my artwork over so that I get a little bit closer to the center point. For this example, that should be pretty good. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and hide my guides that I just created. And with my artwork selected, let's talk about these arrows for a second. If I hold S on my keyboard, or I press S, I'm sorry, and I bring up my scale tool and I get the pivot point, I have these red arrows, these pinkish kind of colored arrows in the vertical and the horizontal axes here. And if I hit S on my keyboard and I hold Shift and I go in the direction of the up and down, I can actually scale my artwork up and down on that axis right here. And you can see that it's a little bit wonky here. And sometimes that happens when you don't scale exactly in an up and down direction. So you want to scale actually really close to this vertical direction in this case to get that vertical scaling that happens. And the same thing happens in our horizontal scaling. So if I hold Shift and I click and drag with my keyboard, I can scale in a horizontal direction. And the last one's probably a little bit more tricky, and that's going to be scale, proportionate scale, either larger or smaller, but that's going to affect, that's going to be in the direction of the blue arrows here. So you're going to want to move your mouse in a same line as what the blue 45-degree arrows are showing. So if I hold S on my keyboard and I scale in at a 45-degree angle, then that's going to be able to scale that proportionally. And if you get off of that 45-degree angle, you'll get something a little bit wonky. So you're going to want to stay close to that 45-degree angle and be sure to hold Shift, or else you could get some really strange effects happening. So constrain that by holding Shift and go at a 45-degree angle inward or outward, and that's how you can scale your artwork that way. And the other feature that you can do with the scale tool, by hitting S on your keyboard, you can change your pivot point to any location and you can scale proportionally to that as well, and even larger if you want. So let's undo that a couple of times. All right. So those are a few different ways that you can use the scale tool inside of Adobe Illustrator. I hope this is helpful.